A few weeks ago, the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America initiated a series of webinar discussions and panel interviews on racism and injustice, prompted by unrest and protest throughout the country. But we wanted also to probe other challenging issues, perhaps related, but certainly apparent in our communities, such as anti-Semitism. There must be some link with the Passover story and liberation from slavery. As an Orthodox Christian, I am appalled and scandalized by certain statements in some parts of the Orthodox world by bishops and theologians regarding our Jewish sisters and brothers, or by anti-Semitic assumptions in general about our scripture, history, and liturgy. So what is the role of the church or religion, which has often led some Christians who do not like to think of themselves as anti-Semitic to harbor views that ultimately reinforce anti-Semitism? Some of this, I suspect, may emerge from a narrow worldview that ignores what happens in the broader society as somehow being related or even directly connected to what happens in the church or in the heart. But some of it stems from a misunderstanding or lack of understanding about the roots of anti-Semitism. I'm very grateful to be speaking with four special guests and friends. The Reverend Dr. Demetrios Tonias is Lecturer of Religious Studies at Hellenic College in Boston. He is also Dean of the Annunciation Greek Orthodox Cathedral of New England and Ecumenical Officer of the Greek Orthodox Metropolis of Boston. While completing his doctoral studies in theology at Boston College, Father Tonias specialized in church history, Old Testament, and comparative theology with a focus on the Jewish Christian historical experience in the Greek-speaking East. The Reverend Dr. Brandon Gallaher is Senior Lecturer of Systematic and Comparative Theology at the University of Exeter and has been Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, the University of Notre Dame, and Doshisha University in Japan. His publications include Freedom and Necessity in Modern Trinitarian Theology. He served in the press office of the Ecumenical Patriarchate during the Holy and Great Council in 2016, and was a member of the recent Commission of the Ecumenical Patriarchate that produced an unprecedented text on the social ethos of the Orthodox Church. Dr. Aaron Hollander is Associate Director of the Graymore Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute, Associate Editor of the journal Ecumenical Trends, and affiliate faculty at the Centro Pro Unione in Rome. He received his doctorate on theology and culture from the University of Chicago Divinity School, while his research focuses on the dynamics of ecumenical and interreligious conflict and coexistence, as well as the political power of holiness and the contemporary conditions of sectarianism. And Rabbi Noam Marans is Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations of the American Jewish Committee, where he has served for 2 decades. A recognized leader of Catholic-Jewish dialogue, he has also expanded the AJC's engagement with Muslims, Latino evangelicals, and Latter-day Saints, leading efforts to turn back anti-Israel initiatives within mainline Protestant denominations. He earned a BA in political science at Columbia University and an MA and rabbinical ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Let me start with you, Father Dimitri. What are the major historical factors that have influenced the relationship of Orthodox Christians and Jews through the ages, and how does this shared experience inform their relationship today?
Well, it's a long-lasting relationship because, as we know, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD precipitated, a cataclysmic change within the world of Judaism, and that the two predominant faiths to emerge from the ruins of the temple Orthodox Christianity. If we think of the Orthodox Church as the early church and the adherence to the patristic tradition, and Rabbinic Judaism. And so they share a common scriptural text, but they share a common historical experience. Both are coming from the ancient Near East, and both were influenced by the Hellenistic tradition. And in many ways, Hellenism was the irresistible force, and Judaism was the immovable object. And it was the same thing for the early Christian church, which was Jewish, predominantly Jewish church, and as it was for Rabbinic Judaism as well. And so you have that struggle with Hellenism that, although both Christians and Jews would react to the idolatrous pagan world, both of them were highly influenced by it. And we see the influence of Stoic philosophy on Philo of Alexandria, for example. And Philo was as influential in Judaism in the first century as he was for the early church fathers, such as Gregory of Nyssa, whose Life of Moses is greatly influenced by, as recent scholarship demonstrates, by Philo. And so, as we move on through the historical experience, when the Christian Empire moves to when the Roman Empire moves to a Christian Empire, you have the experience of that many people don't know about, of the Romani Jewish community, which was a Greek-speaking Hellenistic Jewish community, and in many senses was influenced by the Orthodox Christian world that surrounded it. From that period, we move into the Paleologian dynasty. I know we're commencing a lot of history here, but which really saw a renaissance of Jewish culture in the Greek-speaking East. And then we come to really, as we look into our contemporary experience, the experience under Ottoman rule, where both of them were zimmi under the Turks, where they were subject populations and subject to the same restrictions that you saw are the Jewish community in the West. And so many things like distinctive clothing, the confinement to certain types of professions and jobs that we would identify with as a uniquely Jewish experience in the West, was something that both of them, along with other religious minorities, shared under Ottoman rule. And under Ottoman rule, both communities, along with the Armenians and other religious minorities organized under the Millet system, were put into competition with each other. And so we see the strains of that even to today, where one community might be elevated by the Porte, by the Sultan, and community might be put down, and vice versa over time. In the silk industry, for example, there was great competition between the Greek Orthodox Christians and the Jewish community. You had also the experience of a new Jewish community from the West, the Sephardic community that came into Thessaloniki, into Salonika, which in the Jewish consciousness was called the Mother of Israel. There was such a large Jewish presence that was there. And so, there was the relationship of these of a new population in the area that really absorbed and supplanted the Romani population, and then coexisted with whatever remained of the Orthodox presence in that area. And then as we move into the contemporary period, with the Greek War of Independence, where Greece secured its independence, many in the Jewish community had an affiliation for the Ottoman position, but many stayed as well and became thoroughly Hellenized, we'll use that term, and in a national sense identified as Greeks and Jews, and were fiercely Jewish and fiercely Greek. We have to remember that the highest decorated officer in the Second World War was Lieutenant Mordecai Friezes, who when in the Asia Minor Wars, when he was captured by the Turks, was allowed, as a Jew, he was allowed to go free. And he said, "No, I stay with my men. I'm a Greek." So we have that. Of course, there is the experience of the Shoah, which greatly, did great harm and damage to as in many areas of Europe, to the Jewish population in Greece, especially in Thessaloniki. We have many instances of the righteous among the Gentiles and within the Greek Orthodox community that, in an amazing, if you just permit me for a moment, an amazing story that many aren't familiar with. You have Archbishop Maskinos, who was under occupation in Greece, who fiercely defended the Jewish population in terms of writing a strong letter to General Stroop, who was the future commandant in Warsaw, who put down the Warsaw uprising, not a man to be trifled with. And when he was told to cease and desist, or else he would be shot, he sent a one-sentence reply back to Stroop saying, "It's our tradition that Greek priests are hanged, not shot. We ask you to respect that tradition."
So Father, this history is crucial, I think, and most people are actually unaware of it. Yeah. What they are more aware is what you're getting into now, and that's the Holocaust. So tell us a little bit about that history in terms of Christian-Jewish relations.
Well, in terms of speaking in Greece, which was the epicenter of the Orthodox experience with the Shoah, the Holocaust, in Thessaloniki, most of the Jewish community was wiped out. And the efforts of the Greek prelate there, Demetrios, who was the metropolitan of Thessaloniki, he went directly to the Rabbi Zvi Koretz, who was the chief rabbi of Thessaloniki, and he warned him. And he said, these people are dangerous. Don't help them at all. Unfortunately, Rabbi Koretz was educated in Germany, and he, there are many stories around it. And in defense of him, he didn't believe that the people that he was educated with, the cultured German people, could be capable of such a thing that he was being warned about. And he gave the list of all he was very organized because he was German trained, of all the Jewish residents of Thessaloniki to the German occupying force, and they were taken away very quickly. In Athens, now you have to imagine that the Jewish community, as I said, was a historic community, especially Thessaloniki, because they're the Sephardim that came from the Iberian Peninsula and came under the reign of Bayezid II into Salonika. And they were very distinctive. They spoke Ladino. They kind of stood out. The Jewish Greeks in Athens thought they were protected because they considered themselves, we're Jews, but we're Greeks. We don't look different. We don't talk different. We're Greeks and we're Jews. They're not going to bother with us. Archbishop Damaskinos said, don't fool yourselves. So the first thing they did, working with the police commissioner Everett, was his name, is they got the chief rabbi of Athens out of the country. And they issued identity cards and baptismal records, not undergoing false baptism or anything, just getting them identity records, and got the local population out of the city. And the letter that I mentioned before they wrote to Stroop was very telling, because this is important from a theological point of view. He says, we define no distinction in Scripture, quoting Paul, between Greek or Jew. These people are Greek citizens. They've been defenders of our nation. They've fought for our nation. They've contributed to the economy. And if you have any concern about them, we will guarantee the safety of the occupying force. And the other thing he did is he wrote to the prime minister, Longothotopoulos, of the Queensland government it was the Greek government under the Germans. And it was pressing what he said. He said, remember, history is going to judge all of us. Let the responsibility fall on the foreigners, on the Germans, because one day you're going to be answerable if something happens to these people. And so he saw an end to the war. He saw what was going to happen. He saw the judgment of history. He saw the witness of the faith. And he signed his name in big letters like John Hancock underneath it. And it was signed by many others too, leaders of the pharmaceutical industry, doctors, professionals, put their signatures on it, but he was the one who represented it. And keep in mind, this is as strong a statement as I've ever seen from a religious leader. And he wasn't in the United States, thousands of miles away in safety. He was under an occupying force, but he had the guts to stand up for what was right. And he knew that if anything happened to him, they'd have to bring a few more divisions down to put down the revolt if they killed the Archbishop of Athens.
So let me bring Aaron in here. Aaron, the part that people have sort of see it in their minds is the story of the Holocaust. And I wonder if you can tell us why it is that the Holocaust in particular so shook up Christian-Jewish relations, and why do you think it's important to reassess long-standing Christian traditions about Jews?
I think I'd like to take a look at this less from a philosophical or theological perspective and more as Father Demetrios is doing in a historical light. Many of the great philosophers of the 20th century have spoken about the Holocaust, the Shoah, as an abyss into which rational understanding tumbles and can't find its way out again. So it's not so much to try to make sense out of what happened and how it led to a renewal of relations so much as to look historically at what happened afterwards. How is it that the Christian churches have found ways of reckoning with Christian anti-Jewish attitudes over history, which are in many ways as old as the church, even in the earliest days of the church, where they were intra-Jewish polemics, which have been retrieved and re-articulated in such a way as to forget that they were Jews critiquing aspects of Judaism and instead become blanket statements or sort of objectifying statements. So one way in which the Holocaust was so important in shaking up Jewish-Christian relations is that it was a wake-up call, a horrific wake-up call to the Christian churches about the consequences of anti-Jewish polemic and assumptions that had pervaded church history. An example of that would be the assumption that Jews are guilty in perpetuity for the rejection and execution of Christ. Martin Luther famously described Jews as abandoned by God and worthy of punishment were they not to convert. And that attitude, it's not to say that everybody who came from a culture in which that was extant really took that on board and really believed it with all their heart and was ready to go out and commit acts of violence. But sociologists speak about the ways that even low-grade attitudes of intolerance, when allowed to pervade, will, even among people who would never commit acts of violence themselves, still provide a foundation and tacit approval for increasingly extreme and institutionalized forms of punishment. And so it was, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the churches couldn't ignore the fact that even if Christian anti-Jewish assumptions might not have been directly responsible for the extraordinary violence of the period, were at least entailed. And they made it much easier for self-professing Christians in many cases to participate in the mass murder of Jews in Europe. So that's one area in which Christian-Jewish relations have been changed. It's hopeful, I think at least, that the churches, several churches have issued very unambiguous statements taking responsibility for the history of Christian anti-Judaism and being quite explicit about the errors, whether biblical or philosophical or cultural, entailed in those positions. You see it in Nostra Aetate in the Catholic Church. The Lutheran, the ELCA in 1994 issued a statement owning and apologizing and grieving Martin Luther's positions against the Jews. Just in 2019, the Church of England similarly. So that's a hopeful sign. I think the other key way that Christian-Jewish relations have been upended in the decades since relates to mass emigration from Europe into other parts of the world of Jews, leading then to integration and intermarriage. So in the United States, at the very least, we see not only sort of an increasing interest among religious leadership among Christians and Jews, but also a greater familiarity among people. It's not uncommon at all for Christians and Jews to be part of one another's family. My own family. I have many friends, and I myself have one Christian parent and one Jewish parent. This leads to a different kind of relationship that's very normal, that's very regular, and has not in all places, and this is certainly not to say that anti-Jewish assumptions and even to the point of conspiracy theories aren't alive and well in our society, and yet as Abraham Joshua Heschel famously put it, we remain strangers in some ways, and yet there's an increasing recognition that we are on another level and a deeper level siblings and part of one another's lives in a way that can't but dispel or at least call into scrutiny some of the assumptions that Christians would have had about Jews that were fantasy Jews.
Right.
So much of the anti-Jewish polemic doesn't relate to real people. It relates to a figment. And it takes real maturity and courage, I think, to own up to that. But it has been possible, and it must remain possible.
It is possible. That's the goal, obviously, but it's a struggle. I mean, I know friends, Christians who've married Jews, and it's been a struggle. And part of that, the part that I understand at least, is the part that the Orthodox aren't able to sort of accept here. So the Greek Orthodox. Rabbi Noam, can you take this a little further and tell us, Aaron's spoken about sort of pre-Holocaust and post-Holocaust, but how has anti-Semitism evolved? And what do you think, like Aaron spoke, what do you think is the relevance of the Holocaust in this evolution?
Thank you. I think we have to begin with acknowledging why we are discussing this in the first place at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because what we thought was gone and buried with the Holocaust is, and anti-Semitism is on the rise, not only in the lands of Europe, but even here in the United States, where the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America has its footprint. And notwithstanding all the accomplishments that have been achieved in Christian-Jewish relations and self-reflection after the Shoah, and they are real and valid and transformative and revolutionary, they're game changers, we are still confronting the reality of anti-Semitism, including the murder of Jews at prayer in synagogues on Shabbat morning, on the Sabbath, in the United States of America, and attacks against Jews in Brooklyn and in Jersey City and in Muncie. Unfortunately, the list is long, in addition to Pittsburgh and Poway, which received the greatest attention. What's different today than the mid-20th century and the Shoah and the Holocaust is that overwhelmingly government and civil and religious society is outspoken against it. And that certainly includes the Orthodox Church at the highest levels, whether it's His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, or in the United States, His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros. So that's a different narrative. And therefore, the comparisons have their limits, even though the threat is very real. Any physical threat to the Jewish people is a problem. And we need to use all the resources we have to combat it. And that means that we have to deal with the subtle and not so subtle climate issues that emanate from Christian doctrine, whether it's directly or indirectly felt, whether it's the way that a story is told from religious scriptures, whether it's the way that allusions to the Jewish people in a derisive way may appear in a hymn, even if it has a long-standing traditional innocence to it. We have a responsibility as religious leaders to address these things. And I believe that that ultimately will be a contributing factor to mitigating this spike in anti-Semitism, because we no longer have the luxury of ignoring it and pretending like it's not back. And religious leaders, despite the growth of secularism, have an ability to influence society in a dramatic way, particularly here in the United States, where the advances of secularism that we see in Europe have not fully reached. I'll add one little piece to this, which I think is relevant to Orthodox Jewish dialogue, and that is the rise of nationalism and its parallel rise of xenophobia and racism and anti-Semitism in the lands where Orthodox Christianity is still flourishing. And we have to be very conscious of that. The underbelly, it's marginal, but it's migrating towards the center. That which was cast to the margins of society, not that there's a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic thought, but the legitimization of those that had been marginalized because of their ideas are now moving towards the center and being allowed to flourish. I think that concerns us greatly. So in short, the lessons of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the Christian self-reflection, whether it's the formal way that the Catholic Church and liberal Protestant denominations went, or more an evolutionary way within Orthodox Christianity, those advances are there, but we have a responsibility to be mindful against its reinserting itself into mainstream society, including within the leadership sometimes of these nationalist churches, if I may say.
Well, thank you for your honesty. We have a separate seminar, actually, a webinar that will look at scripture and the early church fathers. We have a separate webinar again on the more political issues and the issue of nationalism. But we will touch a little more, I hope, in this discussion on liturgy. Let me come to you, Brandon, and sort of begin looking at some of the more philosophical, even sort of theological perspectives here. What is our understanding? What is the Orthodox Christian understanding of the election of Israel?
Well, in order to answer that, I would just want to mention first, in terms of religious diversity, because this is very important to understand, that the Orthodox Church's self-understanding is that it is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the body of the living Christ. But this in no way should be taken to mean that there isn't any truth in other religions or in other religious communities. We believe that Christ, as the Word of God, the Logos, he pervades all things, and in him all things are created. And so the traditional way that the Orthodox understand in terms of religious diversity is to understand that there are seeds of this one Word of God which are scattered everywhere. and that these seeds are one with the one word of God. Saint Justin Martyr, Saint Justin the philosopher, who was a 2nd century church father, said that the seeds of the word are scattered everywhere. And so as Orthodox, we believe that it is possible for people of other religious communities to perceive this truth, and through grace, they too can be illumined. Now, this doesn't mean that we accept everything, otherwise we wouldn't be a distinct body. But we do believe that there is that truth, and that as Orthodox, we believe that one can, as it were, come into the fullness of the truth, which is in Orthodoxy. So it's a type of qualified particularism for Orthodoxy, affirming that. Now, in regard to Israel, this is a sort of sub thing, which I want to understand. So the relationship with Israel is a very special one. It's not like any other religion as such. And there are two, I think, broad tendencies within the Orthodox Christian tradition. The first, more traditional position has been the predominant one up until the last century or so. And this is that what is sometimes called supersessionism. So the position being that there is a new covenant in Christ, and it teaches that in Christ you have Israel, and Israel reflects the old covenant. And with the church, you have a new Israel. So this is the church superseding Israel. And this is very ancient, it should be said. And you find this, for example, in the Epistle of Barnabas, which was written sometime between 70 and 132 AD in the Christian era. And so we see in Barnabas, he writes, "Ours it is, but they," meaning Israel, "lost it. And this may be forever, because Moses had not received it. But they lost it by turning to idols." And he talks about a new covenant of the beloved of Christ, which is given to the church as the new Israel. So this is a very ancient way. Unfortunately, it has led to a lot of violence. And you see it in some church fathers. St. John Chrysostom has some many famous homilies in this regard. And I believe we're going to be getting to it. You also see allusions, portions of it in our liturgy, in the liturgy particularly of Holy Week. So in Holy Friday Matins, there is one hymnography, and I might add, it's not, it's a mixed bag. And this is not to say that the whole thing is just riddled with anti-Semitism. That would be a distortion and a misunderstanding. But in Holy Friday Matins, we read in one hymn, it says, "Thus says the Lord to the Jews, my people, what have I done to you? Or how have I offended you?" The hymn says. "Instead of loving me, you nail me to the cross." And then it says, "I shall call the Gentiles mine. They will glorify me with the Father and the Spirit, and I shall give them life eternal." So this is a way which needs to be owned up to. It is a very strong and predominant way. But there is what I would call a minority report, which dates back to the church fathers. And in this position, it returns to Romans 11 of St. Paul. And it emphasizes that all Israel will be saved, and that the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. And so these very famous passages that in Vatican II, there was a return to, a rereading of, and we see even in somebody like Cyril of Alexandria, who is a 4th century father, and it says, "Although it was rejected, Israel also will be saved eventually." And he says, Israel is saved and will be called at the end. So there are church fathers who are acknowledging the election of Israel as well. And then we turn to the modern period, which takes these seeds, this minority report, and as it were, pours water on them, attempts to make them grow. And here we see the work of Father Lev Gillet, the great French Orthodox theologian, the monk of the Eastern Church. And he calls, so in the middle of the 20th century, he calls for a theology of Christ for Israel. He wants to face up to the anti-Semitism. He wants to face up to the type of theology which is, as it were, smothering the brothers and sisters who are Jewish. And he says that we must certainly not, he writes, abandon our Christian universalism, but this universalism does not exclude the election and the special graces, including the primacy of Israel. This position is one that very recently has been taken up very strongly in a document which comes from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, called, which is mentioned earlier by Father John. This document is called the Social Ethos, or Towards the Life of the World. And in this text, it refers to the fact that we, not only is Israel elect and is God as elect and that is irrevocable, but we must, as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, turn to Israel as our spiritual elders in God's saving revelations. We must turn to them to learn in order to understand how we are engrafted into Israel. So this is a position which I think is now becoming more and more ascendant. But there's a tension.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very glad you raised the content of this document, because I know, and you know, you're involved in it, Brandon, that it is the result of a great struggle, this tension. You said there's struggle and there's sensitivity, I think, in the document. And I'm also delighted that you recall the work of Father Lev Gillet, who was truly an extraordinary, humble and spiritual visionary of our church in the 20th century. You talked about the hymns, and I want to come to Aaron to tell us what he feels about what he heard. It's really interesting that the hymn that you read, for instance, Father Brandon, is probably not noticed all that much when it's sung in the Greek Orthodox Church or in the Slavonic. We're almost more enticed and charmed by the Byzantine music that is so wonderful in Holy Week that we don't always pay attention to what we're chanting or what we're articulating here. So, Aaron, I'm wondering how you hear that. And it's easy for Christians, Orthodox Christians, to say, I'm not anti-Semitic. But there are ways that we are formed and that we depend perhaps on anti-Semitic assumptions without even knowing it. Is that right?
Yes, and this is very important. It goes back to something that Rabbi Noam was saying earlier, that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, it's many things. We're not just talking about explicit hate speech and hate crimes, although of course we are talking about those and really need to face that honestly. But those explicit realities are the proverbial tip of the iceberg, in the sense that they're visible to us, but they are only possible because they rest on top of a much deeper and more pervasive reality that's usually unseen. So the example I'd bring for this that's particularly pertinent to the Orthodox Church is in the theology and practice around the icon. We've been speaking about hymns, and I'd love to hear more from someone with more experience in Orthodox hymnography, but I can at least call our attention to the ways that, without getting too deep into the real complexity around iconoclasm, the way that the formation of Orthodox icon theory and icon theology depends on and has baked into it a number of constructions of Jews and of Judaism as inferior and as death-bound, relying on what Brandon was speaking about, this one paradigm of thinking of Jews as superseded or set aside in favor of the new covenant. So I think it's noteworthy that before iconoclasm, most of the image theory in the Orthodox Church comes in the context of anti-Jewish polemic of one form or another, responding to, on the one hand, accusations, real or imagined, of idolatry, and on the other hand, trying to uproot what would have been called by people like John Chrysostom, Judaizing tendencies in the church. And this is all part of the lengthy history of what's called the parting of the ways, of the de-Judaization of Christianity, which takes many centuries. But by the time we get to the period of iconoclasm, around the 8th century, beginning even earlier, you start to have formations about icons that have a problem. So here I would call on John of Damascus. Think about the treatises of John of Damascus about the icons. John has a problem, which is that on the one at the same time, he has to champion the legitimacy of sacred images, but he also has to deal with the biblical prohibitions against the creation of images for holy spaces. So what he does here is he makes Jews the target of the prohibition and sort of sets the weight of that prohibition on a community that is set aside, so as to maintain for the Orthodox Church the legitimacy of holy images. He says, in effect, prior to the incarnation, no one has seen God. No one has seen God in the flesh. So, of course, it's illegitimate and idolatrous to create images of God or of the angels or what have you. However, with the incarnation, it changes the game. It changes the conditions of possibility, so that those of us who recognize that God has now made God's self visible, well, images, of course, are fair game for us, but not for them. So he manages to, and it's not only John of Damascus, it's really the pro-icon camp in general proves very effective at both disentangling the iconographic tradition from biblical prohibitions against idolatry, but also painting the iconoclastic camp with sort of identifying it with what they would have seen as a creeping Jewish influence in the church. So again, these sense of conspiracy of Jewish networks influencing society, these are very old ideas. They're not only modern conspiracies, even though they are very much still with us. So why is this important today? In the generations after John of Damascus, you get those like Theodore the Studite and Patriarch Nicephorus, another generation taking up Damascene's arguments for the legitimacy of holy images, and they become increasingly hard-line. From the legitimacy of images, now we have arguments for the superiority of images, for the superiority of visual ways of encountering divine presence over purely auditory or aniconic ways of meeting God. So much so that by the end of iconoclasm, the triumph of the icon becomes the triumph of orthodoxy. And the icon itself, which is, by this point, it includes these connotations of superiority over iconoclastic Christian, Jewish, and Muslim ways of making sense out of the divine. The icon becomes the emblem of the Orthodox Church. So my question is, how is the church today going to reckon with this history, without throwing out the cherished tradition, which is obviously that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying, how does the church find ways of continuing to celebrate and to cherish the iconographic tradition while also acknowledging the cruel anti-Jewish entailments that are baked into that history and baked into that tradition. Whether this is in mind or not entering an Orthodox church, it's part of what makes the icon so central to the tradition. And we have to be honest about that.
So let me ask Rabbi Noam then for how you see this, following on from what Aaron is saying. How do you think, before we come to, say, Father Dimitri and Brandon to respond, how do you think the Orthodox Christians could take steps to make sure that the gospel readings or the liturgical hymns don't inculcate or reinforce anti-Jewish views? Rabbi.
So, as I understand it, there is a lot of autonomy within the churches because of the nature of the way Orthodoxy is constructed and the relationship of the ecumenical patriarchate to the various national churches, which is, I understand, looser than perhaps the relationship with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. And therefore, the way that Orthodoxy is going about this is going to look different. There's a long history of the dialogue between Christian Orthodox and the Jewish people, but it, I think, arguably has been slower in addressing these kinds of issues. Although I note that in preparing for this session, that there is enormous literature and writing about this that is becoming more prevalent, including a new journal edition dedicated to it, which I found extremely enlightening and encouraging, although I wonder whether that is more academic and perhaps not hierarchical in its nature. I will say this, although I'm not an expert in Orthodox icons, I certainly understand the power of art to transmit unconscious ideas. This was a serious issue for fueling anti-Jewish sentiment historically, most notably within the Catholic Church, but I suspect elsewhere as well. And it's related to the debate that we have in America today about statues, about how physical images send messages, and how these subtle artifacts are able to communicate. And I think it's up to Orthodox Christians to look at each of these things closely and to determine how they can be recontextualized if elimination is not possible within the traditional understandings. That is an approach that seems to have worked elsewhere. And I think when possible, that which has contributed to a tradition of anti-Judaism, implicit or explicit, it needs to be serious thought to its reconsideration. And when that reconsideration is not possible, for whatever the reason, I'm not Orthodox, I'm Jewish, whatever the Orthodox reason, then there has to be a modus vivendi that will allow it to be understood in a different way so that it does not damage Orthodox Jewish relations, or worse, perpetuate anti-Jewish ideas. I think that that's the approach of the responsible Jewish leadership. We know that it's a process, but there is some impatience with that. I have to share that. It may have to do with structural issues, but I don't want to speak about things that you, my fellow panelists, are more familiar with than I am.
Thank you. So let's turn to the two Orthodox Christian panelists here. And I wonder, Father Dimitri, what I think Rabbi Noam mentioned, sort of elimination. I don't think any Orthodox is that close to eliminating anything right now. But even the word reform sort of makes people edgy. What do you think about the hymns that we have on Good Friday and during Holy Week? What do you think is the effect of this liturgical or iconographic portrayal of Jews? And what's the effect that it has on the Orthodox Christian view of contemporary Jews and Judaism? I'd like to hear Father Dimitri and Father Brandon speak on that.
Okay, well, first, it's important, before I address the question directly, which I will, it's important to understand where the language comes from. The language is not polemical for polemic's sake. The language comes from, and we talked about Hellenism before, it's Hellenistic rhetoric. And there was built into the style, if you will, psolgos, which was invective, half-truths, innuendo, harsh language. Because with praise, you always had diatribe. And if you had one without the other, the audience would be, the congregation in this sense, would be looking at each other, what's going on? Meaning that if you go to see, a speaker, a stand-up comedian or something like that, and he's just all, he's super polite, where's the value in that? And so this type of language just permeates the work of Chrysostom, who qualifies stuff. People don't give, how much he qualifies, give credit enough to Chrysostom. He says, of course, when I speak this way, I don't ever mean that this means violence or anything like that. I don't ever mean that all Jews, you look at who the greatest apostle of all was Paul. He was in love with Paul. Paul was the heavenly trumpet for him. And he said, of course, he was a Jew. And so you can't say that people, there was no built-in anti-Semitic thought in the sense that from birth you're condemned because you were born a Jew. Now, he had very strong beliefs as a Christian, but that wasn't part of it. And the Holy Week language follows in that tradition, and all of it. People say, was Chrysostom anti-Jewish? Well, what did he have to say about heretical Christians? What do you have to say about pagan idolaters? You don't want to know what he had to say about the empress. So he was, it was just the mode of language. And that goes not just for Christians, that goes throughout the Hellenistic world. So now we come to Holy Week. The Holy Week language, we have to be very, very careful before we use the word anti-Semitic, because that's a very broad charge and attitude. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but that's not the focus of the Holy Week hymns. The Holy Week hymns are directed towards the Jewish biblical antagonists, and not even just the Jewish, the biblical antagonists of Christ during the Passion. That's Romans, that's Jews, that's faithless apostles, it's everyone who's going against Christ. That's the story. And the hymns, certainly it's possible for someone to take them and say, as it happened in the West with Passion plays, that's that Jewish community, they did it, But that's not how the hymns are going. If you pay attention to the hymns, look how many times the hymnographer uses the first person personal pronoun, I. Don't make me like the fig tree. Don't make me fruitless. Don't make me faithless. And it's all, as I say every Holy Thursday, don't condemn scribes and Pharisees, empathize with them, because we're them and they're us. Because it's talking about the human condition of faithlessness towards God, that God presents himself and we miss the boat, so to speak. And so it really is more of a call of the individual congregant led by the hymnographer, led by the chanter, really, to self-identify and put themselves in that situation. And really, the hymns put the person, not, oh, we're the triumphant Christians. The hymnographer puts the Christian on the other side. We're standing with them. Because odds are, if we look at the percentages of people who actually stood with Christ, we wouldn't be in that very, very small number, which didn't even include the apostles who all left him there, right? And so this is the focus of the hymns. Now, what people take away from it, that's a different thing. So what's the solution to that? Is the solution, well, these might be problematic, let's excise them? That's going to be super counterproductive. If you want to kill the discussion right away, that's a surefire way to do it, because people would justifiably say, you're blowing up the narrative. You're messing with tradition. And, you know, within Orthodox Judaism, with Orthodox Christianity, tradition, you know, there's a whole song about that, right? So you can't, it'd be self-defeating. So what's the answer? Well, Rabbi Noam, you know, pointed to it. You preach, preach, preach. So the point being is that that's the job of the homilist, to say, who are these hymns talking about? They're not talking about them. They're done. That story's over. They're talking about you. They're talking about me. They're talking about all of us, right? And so, you know, with the sense of contextualizing that, and not just contextualize it, how can we explain it away? There's that contextualization. It's what it really is, and what the story is saying. There's some things, you know, and the same thing goes with iconography. You know, the icons that we're talking about, I can think of 2 or 3 of them, you know. Other than that, I mean, it's usually like a minor figure off to the side. You got to go out of your way to talk about it. You know, talk about the Dormition icon is a prominent example. But other than that, you know, why create an issue where something's there, where something, you know, where one doesn't exist? Let's also keep in mind too, with the idea of Israel. I know there's this idea of supersessionism, New Israel, and all that stuff. The church didn't see itself as New Israel in the early church. They saw themselves as Israel. And in that way, that it is a point of competition between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity, that we're both seeing ourselves as the first thing, as the same thing. And I know, you know, within the idea of, and we can find language that we would classify as supersessionistic, which is a very broad umbrella. But I'm more of an advocate of what's called fulfillment theology, where the church views itself as the pleroma, as the fulfillment, and they self-identify themselves as Israel. Before, at the Udis Axios prayer, no one is worthy, before the great entrance, what does the priest declare? How does he address Christ? CEO Vasilevsky Israel, you are the king of Israel. What does that make us? New Israelites? The term New Israel is very rarely used. I mean, you see it in Sophronius, you got to get a iconoclastic period again. And it's more poetic, like a new Israel, you know, but the church viewed itself as Israel. And in that sense of self-identity, you can look at that as in a negative way. We're the real Israel. You're not Varus Israel and all that. But we can look at it in a more positive way. Preach, preach, preach. That these are 2 people, you know, that call themselves the same thing. Now take a look within the Orthodox Church. In Western Christianity, you don't have this. We commemorate Israelite saints, right? So my son is Elias. He's got a saint day, a feast day, and all that. That doesn't happen in the West. All of them, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, the prophets. The other thing, getting back to Holy Week, something I should have mentioned too, is this language that's being used is very much evocative of the prophetic language. And we look in the Tanakh, if we look in what we call the Old Testament, even that's an anachronism, but anyways, for lack of a better term, you know, they're echoing the prophetic languages out there. And so, you know, they're seeing, you know, Chrysostom's seeing himself as much as Paul is Jeremiah, you know, and the hymns are doing that as well too. And the prophets, you know, let's not just look at the New Testament corpus presented in Holy. Look at the Old Testament corpus, which is front and center. The Jewish Bible is front and center throughout all of this, and that whole tracing of salvation history, you know, is we're laying claim to the same thing. So we could look at that as a competitive way, or we could do what I've called sharing the inheritance, and that's a beautiful place to start, where we share it as brothers and sisters. This idea of who and what Israel is.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. I think it's very important, not New Israel, but Israel. And it sort of brings us full circle as well. I do want to touch on a couple of things very briefly, because this is our target audience here are the various parishes throughout the United States in particular. and I think they'd like to hear at least a brief response. So Father Brandon, following on from Father Dimitri, is there room for any reform? Is that something that the Orthodox would consider? There are some translations of Holy Week that have omitted references to Jews that might be misconstrued. Is that something that should be looked at, should be talked about? What do you think?
Sorry. It certainly needs to be talked about, which is what we are doing right now. And this sort of conversation is not as common as I would hope in Orthodoxy. And I would hope that this would encourage more dialogue. But just to build on what Father Dimitri was saying, and the Rabbi and Aaron, I think you need to separate out here two sorts of issues when you're coming to these texts. One is what Aaron called, and it's a frequent term, is inter-Jewish polemic. And so the texts are, the texts in Holy Week, on Holy Friday in particular, are really echoing St. Paul and the Gospel of John, this invective, this kind of polemical invective, element of rhetoric. And so one needs to be sensitive to this, that you're dealing with elements of debate and also a particular literary genre. Of course, people today, that goes completely over their head. And historically, as Father Thomas Hotko of blessed memory, I remember saying, people would go after celebrating Pascha and conduct a pogrom. So there are instances of this, particularly in the former Russian Empire. Vladimir Solovyov railed against all this type of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish violence. And so one needs to separate out that. And so this intra-Jewish polemic, and to view it in the way that Father Dimitri is saying, using good preaching to be able to contextualize it. And then there are references that I just don't think you can get around. So for example, and I will give you two texts. One, these are both from Holy Friday, the Matins again. It talks about the Hebrew people condemned thee to be crucified, O Christ. And then another passage which always makes me flinch every year. The swarm of those who would kill God, the lawless nation of the Jews. I think when you're dealing with texts like this, you're, especially in a modern context, you're tipping over. So the first text that I mentioned that talks about the Hebrew people in this type of expression, in certain translations, it becomes a transgressing people. They end up coming up with other forms to get around this, or as it were, a gloss. And so you're dealing with a bit of a dance. So on the one hand, one has to be extremely careful when you are fiddling with things. One of the things I would say as an Orthodox Christian, but somebody who is a very respectful, somebody who understands the Catholic tradition made some very large changes. I'm not referring to its liturgy in regard to the perfidious Jews, but just general changes in its liturgical tradition. They had implications that they could not have foreseen. For example, the direction in which you're changing. So one has to be very, very slow and very careful. And on the other hand, you need to be very careful that you avoid a type of approach that would, as it were, try to obliterate the uniqueness of the church. And this distinction between new and old covenants, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, all of our theology, as it were, hangs on that. So what is the way forward? First way forward is preaching, as Father Dimitri had said, good catechesis. Second way forward, is to be able to look at these texts, and if you're doing them in a context of translation, you can find forms of language that are able to, as it were, not be in your face, to bring across the wrong message, and to emphasize that we should all be understanding that we're all responsible for the death of Christ. We're all the Jews and the Romans in this circumstance. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion. And as we are a hierarchical church, the ones who lead in this and bless are our bishops. And I'm glad to say that they did that in the text called the Social Ethos. They blessed us to make this journey. And I think this will go on in the future as well.
So I really don't think as Orthodox we have a problem with moving slowly and carefully. That's hardly the issue for us, but I do understand being respectful and attentive to the history and the nuances. Aaron, again, briefly, we've moved beyond our time, but this is a fascinating discussion. You mentioned conspiracy theories, and I don't want to drop the ball on that, because the truth is there's a lot of that as well. Brandon mentioned and Father Demetrios mentioned preaching, enlightening people about, what the background is to all this, both philosophical and historical. But we should also call out people who do espouse conspiracy theories, and that goes for bishops as well. It's not any, I think, secret. The former Metropolitan of Kalavrita, the current Metropolitan of Piraeus in Greece. I mean, these are outrageous advocates of these kinds of conspiracies. Aaron, you've lived in Cyprus, and I'm just curious, very briefly, what knowledge did you find that Orthodox Christians in Cyprus have of the Jewish community, whether in Cyprus or whether elsewhere in the world? How aware were they of the Jewish community?
So, of course, I don't want to speak for others. I lived for about a year in Cyprus, all told, while pursuing research for my doctorate. And Cyprus is, such a wonderful, fascinating place for many reasons, but there was a sizable Jewish population there prior to the creation of the state of Israel. That population is now much smaller, but the proximity of Cyprus to Israel and the regular exchange, you have Cypriots traveling to Israel regularly, you have Israelis traveling frequently to Cyprus, in no small part for civic marriages, that there is, as I was speaking about earlier, a greater sense of familiarity simply from in a kind of everyday sense than you might find in some parts of the Orthodox world. The conversations that I had were not primarily about this, but I did pick up that there didn't seem to be a lot of active reflection or certainly not active invective or anti-Jewish rhetoric being slung around in Cyprus. What little I heard tended to be positive, but positive in maybe a double-edged sense. And this brings me back to, I think, aspects of what Father Demetrios and Brandon are saying, which I would want to push back a little about and be a little cautious about, that there are some ways that even positive assessments of Judaism and Jews in the church, or positive framings of even the Jews will be saved, even the Jews will witness to Christ in the last days, and isn't that great, that these are still ways that Jews are being effaced or being appropriated as foils for Orthodox self-improvement or for the Christian narrative. I think that's still a real problem. It's not one that can be addressed by chucking out the tradition, but that strikes me more as indicative of philautia than eleos, more self-love than mercy. And I think there's a tension that remains here. In Cyprus, impressions I got from people were on the part of monks, for example, statements of the sort that, well, the Jews will be among the final great witnesses to Christ, and therefore we are all destined to be together. Well and good, but at what cost in that kind of a framing? On the other hand, I would frequently hear from Greek Cypriots a positive assessment of whether elements of Israeli society on the one hand, or of Jews as being on our side vis-a-vis Muslims. So the Greek Cypriot experience being so tied up with, and you addressed this earlier, or somebody addressed this earlier, I think Father Dimitri, in relation to the Ottoman history, where Jews and Christians, competitive in some ways, but also united in some ways in their social situation, still today, following the Turkish invasion of Cyprus and partition of Cyprus, there is among Greek Cypriots, certainly not all, but in more than one conversation, a sense, oh, Jews are, they're more like us, they're on our side, whereas Muslims are going to be the problem going forward. And of course, the anti-Muslim rhetoric in the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox ascetic world is pronounced. And so I think that would be maybe my last word on this, is that it's really vitally important that even as we do everything in our power intellectually and socially to uproot Christian anti-Judaism, we can't do that at the expense of Muslims.
That's a great point.
Right? We can't make them the new foil, the new villain, the new corrosive influence. And if that kind of hatred and exclusion and scapegoating is just migrated from one community to another,
I'm so glad.
we have succeeded in continuing to corrode ourselves spiritually and ethically.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much for that. We need to wrap up, but I'm just wondering, Father Dimitri, you mentioned preaching, and obviously that's crucial here. What about discussion in parishes? And to you and to Rabbi Noam, what about teaching in seminaries? How much do our seminarians learn about this stuff? I know you teach, but in general, not just as an elective course or a course, on Christian-Jewish relations. How much are seminarians in your seminary, Rabbi Noam, taught about Christian-Jewish relations and how we should move forward?
Well, should I start?
Yes, please, yes.
Well, I like to tell people, the Catholic Church has battalions working on this issue. Father Brandon and I and a couple others, are the ones who do it as a focus. But it's minimal. I mean, for Pete's sake, the emphasis that we can even, and a lot of that, before we get too hard on the seminaries for this, we all have our requirements we have to fill. We all have to be accredited. We all need our field education, all the mundane stuff, the essential stuff that has to be done. So the amount of time, this would be relegated to the role of an elective. We have to understand that there's, so many credits and so much time. You got to fill your base requirements.
Father, if I can just interrupt, and I don't mean just as an elective course. There is some sense in which this kind of spirit should pervade all of the courses. When we teach Old Testament, when we teach New Testament, when we teach liturgy, when we teach history. And I'm just wondering, how can we convince seminaries that this needs to be done?
I was getting to that, and the point that if it existed, it would exist as an elective. But what's important is that when I talk about the shared inheritance, and it's my bailiwick, it's the world in which I live, and so it's an historical, for me as an historian, it's an historical story, as we kind of did in a short condensed period, and the points of confluence are there everywhere. When I was doing my doctorate at BC, I taught a course called Religious Quest. Right, I was a TA for Rabbi Ruth Langer. She was my advisor at Boston College, and it was Christianity and Judaism from the jump, really from the beginning, bracketing with the intertestamental period to the contemporary period. And we can do that if the faculty is knowledgeable enough about it, and they are, to put in and put these points of confluence in there, and see how these two communities that are so closely tied to each other, follow through, and it follows through theologically,
Right.
When we talk about the idea, the concept of what Israel is, if it's a Christological issue, it's an ecclesiological issue, it's an historical issue.
Exactly right.
It touches on all those aspects of it.
But we need to remember to do that, and we need to remember deliberately to do it deliberately, because that's.
But let me just say one more thing. We say we share common, the Tanakh, we share the Old Testament, we share the Bible together, and all that. What does the average Orthodox in the street know about the Old Testament? I mean, we talk about anti-Semitism. There are people who think, well, that's for Jews. We don't have them because we lost the Old Testament reading in the liturgy. Unless they go to Vespers, they never hear. They never realize it's embedded in everything they hear. All the hymnography is, replete with the way we address God are all Old Testament's way. Kyrie ton dynamion, Lord of the powers, Kyrie o Theosimon, my Lord, my God. Those are all Old Testament appellations of God. But at that fundamental level, that's the first hurdle we got to get over.
Yep. Rabbi?
It seems to me that in addition to the historicity and the permeation within the curriculum of the things that we are speaking about today, I think there needs to be an experiential piece. That is to say, I think it's possible for the Greek Orthodox within the United States to assure that young seminarians have interaction with a rabbi during their education. And perhaps this happens, but I suspect that it doesn't happen enough. And it ultimately is more important than even the academic of the relationship and the humanizing. In the Jewish seminaries, it's a completely different question, obviously, because Judaism exists before Christianity, and it's taught that way. But what we are seeing today is more and more there's grappling with problematic texts. It's important to note that no tradition of antiquity is without this challenge. All traditions have it. And now that we're in the new generations of Jews being educated, where anti-Semitism is not necessarily as prevalent and vicious, even though we know that it's on the increase today, but compared to the past and the experience of the Shoah and medieval persecution and blood libels and pogroms, Jews are beginning to look at their own texts. As Jews are more comfortable within society, as there is more understanding of the state of Israel as a Jewish power that did not exist historically. There is a growing desire to look at those texts and to dig deep into the tradition of exegesis that is more normative within Judaism than fundamentalism, and see how those texts can be understood in their proper context. And you see today what was unimaginable, for example, in Orthodoxy, in the documents that are coming out with regard to the relationship with the Catholic Church, which I think is very enlightening. And it's about how the Jewish tradition and how Jews that are now being accepted in a different way than through the 2 millennia, how they need to now view the other.
So in your seminaries, Rabbi, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but in your seminaries, are students exposed to these dialogues and texts, and the fact that there's a Greek Orthodox.
All of the seminaries,
Good.
all of the seminaries have opportunities for interreligious dialogue,
Good.
like what Father Demetrios was saying. There's so much to do
Right.
and so little bandwidth.
Yeah.
But the Jewish seminary, I mean, the Jewish Theological Seminary, since the 1950s under Professor Finkelstein, where I was ordained, have been the leaders in interreligious dialogue and engagement. But it cannot ever be taken for granted. But it also has to be in the context of the Jews not being necessarily the beseechers, but the partners.
Close here
change.
because we're literally going to be cut off, I think, in terms of timing. Brandon, do you have any final remarks? Well, we literally have 1 minute, and I do want you to bring, I'm kind of sorry, disappointed in myself that we have an all-male panel here, but I wonder if you can at least mention Mother Maria Skoptsova as well. So, Brandon.
Yeah, I think what I would say in regard to our conversation that we've had is this is a beginning, and it's a beginning of friendship. Friendship is what is important. When I was in seminary at St. Vladimir's Seminary, we did have an inter-seminary dialogue with, I believe it was Jewish Theological Seminary. So I met with future rabbis, and we became friends. And once you actually see the other person as you have, as it were, to thinking of Buber here, an I-thou dialogue. If you encounter them over a cup of tea, they become your friends, they enter your life.
Right.
Then you can no longer, as it were, deal with the casual anti-Semitism as anything but a scandal, as a slap on the face of Jesus Christ, who was a Jew. And so we think of Mother Maria Skoptsova, who took this to heart. My youngest child is named after her. And she went along with Father Dimitri Klepinin, they're both saints of the Orthodox Church, and they went and they were righteous among the Gentiles, and they went to save the Jews and to hide them and to smuggle them. There's even a wonderful children's book which has been written on this. They made friends with them because they knew that you can only be a friend with God if you are a friend with the people of God. So I would say that friendship is the path. And with friendship, repentance, and understanding that the other person touches your life, because in their face you see Jesus Christ, who was a Jew.
Can I, in 1 minute, share my favorite story about Mother Maria?
Yes.
Which clicks in exactly with what Brandon is saying and with our conversation earlier about iconography.
Yes.
The wonderful account that she is approached at her community, at her home, by Nazi officers under the occupation saying, look, we know you're harboring Jews. We know you're sheltering them. You need to bring them out right away and hand them over, or we're going to arrest you, and that's going to be that. And she says, okay, I'll give in. I'll bring out the Jews that I'm harboring. And she goes back into her community and fetches an icon of the Theotokos and Christ child and brings it out and hands it to the Nazi officers and says, here you go. Here are the Jews I'm harboring. Take them. So this is someone who has entered into the holiness of the iconographic tradition, who recognizes, well,
Thank you so much.
as far as Jews are represented in Orthodox iconography, you can't get much holier than that.
Yep. Thank you so much. Well, friends, Father Tonias, Dr. Gallaher, Dr. Hollander, and Rabbi Marans, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts. I do hope, as Brandon said, that this is a new beginning to a vital conversation in our church. And my thanks also go to all of you for watching and listening.